Good afternoon from the Monastery of All Saints of North America. I had received quite a few inquiries and letters during my chemo and radiation treatment about asking if I was going to lose my hair and beard. Fortunately, they used capecitabine for the chemotherapy, which doesn't remove your hair and beard. So I still have them, and I'm rather grateful because it took so many years and so much fertilizer to grow it that I wouldn't want to have to go through all that again. Today we're going to discuss a subject that I've discussed a few times before. And I think it's a very important subject, and I think it's one that's ignored far too often because people tend to want to live in the past. I always hear somebody talking about a golden age 1,000 years ago, 100 years ago, or something like that. And I'd like to remind people that before the advent of antibiotics, there was no golden age. And now that we practically no longer have antibiotics, the one thing that we can look back to is the time when we did have antibiotics as perhaps a bit of a golden age. But I want to talk a little bit about the axial period, which I've talked about before, the axial era. And some of you, of course, will know what the axial era refers to, others won't. So I'll give a little bit of a review before I go into what I consider to be Axiel II, or the Second Axial Period. The first great axial era, the expression was coined by the German existentialist Karl Jaspers. And it was the era between about 800 BC and 400 BC. I would always like to move it back a little bit so that it includes the great Azerbaijani prophet Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, because he was really a part of the foundation stone of the axial era. The axial era was a period in history in which civilizations had stabilized, and there was ample food supplies, and there was a system of government which allowed for a certain number of scholarly inclined people to begin to spend almost all their time in that kind of pursuits. And in that era, you had lawgivers, the great ethicists, people like Confucius in China, who was one of the great ethicists. And the Buddha was lived, and Buddhism was beginning to develop in that era. Also, there were some great developments in the Hindu world as well. More familiar to us, the prophet Isaiah was writing at that time, and this is perhaps what makes the prophecies of Isaiah so remarkable. At the same time, the school of Miletus among the Hellenistic peoples was starting to develop a combination of philosophy and science, or as we would say, a philosophy-based science. The great question of the era was about permanence and change. What is permanence? Is there permanence? What is change, and is there actually change taking place? These were very significant questions, and perhaps still are. And also, people outside of Egypt were contemplating the meanings of life and death in ways they have not before. The Egyptians, of course, had been really involved in the contemplation about life and death and afterlife already since maybe 6,000 years BC, maybe perhaps even longer. The Great Pyramid was built in 2500 BC. And before that, of course, the Step Pyramid of Joshua was already nearly 1,000 years old. So outside of Egypt, these questions have not been contemplated quite so much. So this age of ferment gave us a system of ethics, a system of law, and had a huge impact on religious thought as well. We had the Tao becoming formed in China at this time, and so there were great ferment in human thought all around. It was facilitated also by the advent of writing, because the advent of writing, which would have developed in Mesopotamia, and maybe even in Egypt almost simultaneously, This is what it's usually given as the beginning of history. About 7,000 years ago, between 7 and 6,000 years BC, writing began to develop. And the traditions of people began to be set down in writing eventually. In Chaldea, of course, the writing was primarily about business transactions, keeping records, later for imperial decrees. But historians began to, or chroniclers really, not historians, began to develop, and they would record the verbal tradition or oral traditions which had been handed down. So with this advent of writing and of examining the oral traditions in a way, a system of ethics and law were drawn from these kind of traditions, what we would often call mythology. And mythology should never be discounted as being something that's false. Mythology has profound roots in realities, and the traditions that are handed down orally are often very dependable. So this whole era of time really saw a change in the way human beings think, and they would begin to regard themselves as having personhood. This was really the dawn of the concept of an actual personhood for the individual. Not individualism, but the idea of personhood itself. So these huge transformations that took place gave the foundation to what we would call modern Western philosophy, as well as modern Eastern philosophy. And from the school of Miletus, many of you have studied in school how this scientific philosophical mode of thinking spread, and really did have this great transformation. Now, I discussed once with a friend of mine, the late Robert Solomon, who was a professor of philosophy in Houston. And we were talking about the Axial Era, and he suggested to me that, well, he wondered if perhaps we hadn't entered a new Axial Era. So I began to pursue that idea and realized that indeed we have entered a second great Axial Era. And that while the Orthodox Church is in the best position to respond in a positive, creative way to this, a lot of the Orthodox teachers and leaders are not. And consequently, they're incapable of responding to this huge transformation that has been taking place, is taking place, in the way human beings think, in the way they reason, in the way they conduct study, and in what they actually understand. A huge transition in the concept of time, space, distance has taken place largely because of technologies. Contact with any other place in the world is instantaneous. And when there's a riot in Tehran, we see it as it's unfolding, not on later newscasts, but as it's unfolding immediately. Everything is quite immediate. So time and space are irrelevant in many aspects of modern thought. Secondly, technology and the sciences have actually increased the rate of the evolution in the human brain. Now, we've fairly well reached the full capacity of the human brain, not because our heads couldn't become larger, but because of the amount of energy that's consumed for the operations of the human brain. If the brain enlarged, the rest of the body would suffer, because the amount of energy that has to be generated has to be taken in from someplace outside of the body. So the physics of the brain have limited aspects to the increase in the size of the brain, but the evolution is taking place in the modes of operation. For example, we no longer need to think in terms of knowledge, but of information. The knowledge that has built up over the centuries is really too great for the capacity of the human brain to store a great deal of it. This is why we have specialization in medicine, in sciences, in philosophy, and in almost every scholarly and scientific act of mankind. We have specializations because the full scope of a whole discipline is too great and too large. So instead of trying to store all of the knowledge in the brain. We now look for information and sources of information. And most of the time people are storing up where they can find the information and certain amounts of information. And this changes the whole understanding of learning, of what we learn and how we learn, both. And these things have undergone tremendous changes. The other thing that is undergoing change is the way we comprehend humanity. And this is why we find that so much of the younger generation are not the least bit interested in or have disdain for our prejudices and our hatreds and also some of the things that we hold dear at the same time. Because these things can be quite incomprehensible to people who have information easily at hand. And consequently, they don't need any longer to live by ideologies or mythologies. They can grab the information almost instantaneously. And this breaks a great deal of the way that some people are still trying to teach the Orthodox faith. When I was invited to present a paper at Magnitogorsk in Russia in the Year of Youth, one of the main questions, and I think the subject of the conference, in fact, was the moral struggle facing today's young people. And the one point that I thought was really important to make was that when we start teaching about morality, we not present it as if God was a giant curmudgeon sitting on the outer rim of the universe, filled with all kinds of fetishes, and if you violate one of the fetishes, he'll do something horrible to you or even destroy your whole nation. More to try to get people to understand what the essence of true morality is. Far too often people will start off with talking about sex. It seems to be a dominant feature in the minds of some people and they can't leave it alone. But what we end up teaching in that respect is, this is naughty, that's nice, this isn't okay, that's okay, and we never get to the root of the issue and the problem. So I would suggest that if you want to tell a group of young people about morality, you start with the ecological crisis and realize that what humanity has done to the ecology of the earth, and is doing, is an enormous act of gross immorality, because it destroys the lives of people already here, makes life impossible for people in some parts of the world, and destroys future generations, makes it impossible for future generations to even subsist. When we look at the numbers of people who are dying worldwide, the fact that one child dies every 5 minutes in the Horn of Africa, and this seems to be a matter of total indifference to some of our moralists. But it is a moral issue, it's a huge moral question. One cannot claim to be pro-life when one is merely anti-abortion. If we give all of our energy to defending the unborn, but totally ignore the already born children, who are suffering horrible pains and dying horrible deaths, then I wonder if people are really interested in the unborn, or if it's simply a fetish they've locked onto, a hot button issue they're frozen on. We can't think about unborn, preborn, already born children in separate terms. Unborn children are children, pure and simple. Children that have already been born are children, pure and simple. So what we're really supposed to be talking about is the defense of children, the protection of children, feeding and keeping alive children who've already been born. So unless you're just a fetishist and you're actually pro-life, then you surely must be deeply concerned with children who are already born and are dying these horrible deaths around the world. Otherwise, I have to say, those who claim to be pro-life and give no thought, no outreach, no help to the tens of thousands of children who die of starvation, of horrible diseases, and all these other things, unless you're giving equal consideration to both, you're simply a fraud. You're a fake. You're not pro-life at all. You're simply anti-abortion. You have a hot-button fetish issue, but you're not pro-life. And I ask people, before you start foaming at the mouth because I said that, to stop and think about it for a moment. Do you really care about children, infants who are already born around the world, who are dying these horrible deaths? And very often, the horror that's come upon them is because of what we, as a human race, have done to the biosphere, the ecological system in which we live. And people who have no concern for that, or people who deny that there's a problem, are certainly immoral, and grossly immoral, and part of the problem. The other thing about this new axial era is that when we talk about nothing but metaphysical abstractions, or talk about who we're supposed to hate or who we're supposed to despise, or who we think God hates and God despises, we click the off button in the brains of most young people. They want to change channels. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to hear about who has hate and malice for whom. They don't even want to hear about a God who's so filled with hate and vindictiveness and vengeance that he would destroy a nation because some people in the nation are sinners. Every human being on the face of the earth is a sinner. Every human being on the face of this earth is a sinner. If God was going to destroy nations because of particular sins, he would have destroyed every nation on the face of the earth long ago. And you ask, why didn't he destroy the Soviet Union at the very beginning, instead of allowing tens of millions of people to be exterminated by Stalin and by Khrushchev as well? And why didn't he wipe out Mao Zedong at the time of the Great March? So if you think that God destroys nations because of particular sins, and burning and blowing up churches and committing mass murder against millions and millions of people didn't lead to the immediate destruction of the Soviet Union, then there's something wrong with your thought and your arguments. The other thing that is pressing is to stop and think that from the time of the first axial era, when philosophies, and theology is a form of philosophy in a way, when philosophies and theologies began to develop from China to at least to the Hellenistic world, to the Hellenic world rather, the philosophers talked about matters which were so far beyond the ordinary person. But it resonated with the ordinary people because they were becoming interested in this idea of change and permanence. So what the philosophers determined and decided upon, there was a trickle down to the ordinary people, which over a long period of time changed the structures of society and the way humans thought. Now there was a great interchange of ideas in this time. The Buddhists had already sent missionaries as far as Rome before the time of Alexander, before the Hellenistic era. And of course in the Hellenistic era you had a kind of a Greek Buddhism. Buddhism had a great influence on thought in Alexandria and Egypt, perhaps on Pythagoras, because Pythagoras has some ideas that are really identical to many of the ideas from Buddhism, and we know that Buddhism was known already in the West at that time. So a lot of exchange of ideas. This beginning of an understanding that we're not isolated pockets of people living with walls between us, but that there's a constant interchange of ideas and of concepts. And this was powerful at the time, but it's infinitely more powerful in our own time, because it was a few months of journeying to go from India to the Hellenic world. Now it's just a matter of clicking a button on a contraption that you have in your hand, whether a cell phone or any other kind of device. Instant sharing of ideas between parts of the world. And when we close ourselves down into a kind of parochial way of trying to communicate to a younger generation, we're not communicating at all. We try to move our models of reality, we try to advance our ideologies to the younger generation, but it doesn't work on very much of a scale. I see in some of the Protestant groups where they have what they call the Jesus camp, which is almost precisely equivalent to Islamic jihad camps. It's just as militant and can inspire just as much violence as a Muslim militant jihad camp can. This is a way of capturing young people and trying to keep them away from the exchange of ideas in the world and impart unto them a kind of apocalyptic, we really should say eschatological, mindset in which any kind and every kind of violence actually becomes possible. And for those of you who are not familiar with these Jesus camps, go and Google it. Look at some of the scenes from them on YouTube. Investigate them a little, together with the hell houses that Protestants use to terrify people into submission. And stop and ask yourself how many Orthodox Christians try to use fear tactics and other means of imparting ideologies rather than the living faith to younger generation. You cannot stop the exchange of ideas, particularly in our era. There's no way that this can be stopped. It's going to go on, it's going to continue. And when we narrow ourselves down so that all we're communicating is fear, hate, with it, that God is out to get us, that God's going to do something horrible to us because we make mistakes in this life, or even because we fall into great sins, that God is waiting, lurking above us to do something awful and horrible to our nation because sinful people live in our country. We, of course, are not sinful people. We're perfect. But they are the sinful people that God wants to destroy our country because of. Younger generations simply aren't buying into this. And it's creating modern atheism. You know, in the more than 25 years that I've been speaking in universities, and not just in North America, but also in Eastern Europe and sometimes in Western Europe. And I asked young people how many in any given university class, because when I speak I wear my Kamalafkan veil, I wear my Exelrasen and everything. So even though I'm often speaking on philosophy of quantum mechanics or something, religion comes up. And I ask a class of 500 or 600 students, sometimes 1,000 if we have some combined classes, particularly in Romania, and ask the students, especially in North America and off the West Coast where we have a lot of Sikhs and Buddhists, ask how many of you were raised in a Christian family? And before, children born before 1990, 1985, it would be about 90%. And I'll ask them, how many of you still consider yourselves to be Christians? It might be 4%, 5%. After the late 80s and 1990, children born after that, the number who say they were raised in a Christian family drops to sometimes 50, 45% of the class. And the number who still consider themselves to be Christians will usually be 2 or 3% of those who are raised in a Christian family. One shouldn't think that because people go to a church on a Sunday that they're actually Christian. Many of the mega churches are a source of entertainment. They pump up our patriotic feelings. They make us feel good about ourselves. But they don't impart anything of the gospel. They impart a lust for money, a lust for riches, and all these other things, but they don't impart the Christian faith. So we shouldn't sort of comfort ourselves to see that some churches are well attended. It doesn't mean anything on the ground. What I really want to convey to a lot of those who are teaching and preaching today is that we should talk more about what this Second Axial Era is really conveying to the world around us and what it's doing to the way people think. We say that trickle-down comes from philosophers in the previous era, but the trickle-down today comes from the scientists, and particularly from quantum mechanics. I would go into a church, and afterwards, if there's an agape, you sit down and talk to some of the young people who are students, and at least 24 times in the last 5 years, I've been engaged in long conversations about cosmic string theory, the superstring theory. And the young people ask quite intelligent questions about it. So we discuss it at some length. We discuss quantum loop gravity and things like this. And don't think that a lot of these university students are really interested in those things and not in the airy-fairy things that we usually talk to them about. So this is something that we have to weigh and take into account, that the communication of information from the physicist, from the scientist, from the neurobiologist, all of this has an impact. And I see that when people are disconnected from the realities of the world we live in today and have not apprised themselves of the real processes of science and neurobiology and these other things, when you start talking about scientific developments and the very concrete, well-proved discoveries in science and neurobiology and these other things, instead of trying to learn something about it, they suggest that all scientists are employed by Satan to destroy Christian faith. But I want to say that when I ask people why they renounced Christianity, young people, in 25 years I think no one has ever mentioned Darwin. It has never been the reason why anybody left the Christian faith. The number one reason among Protestants is the doctrine of atonement. That a God who could have that whole concept of atonement is not worthy of our worship, because we're more moral than he is. And I dare say that the doctrine of atonement is a major source of atheism. But Christian hypocrisy and bigotry, and we see this in profound measure in our day, Christian hypocrisy and bigotry are among the biggest reasons for modern atheism. And so many people who are hyper-moralists especially are hypocrites and bigots. They don't live what they teach. They teach things that are false, patently false. The idea that humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time. Once upon a time, and I use that phrase advisedly, once upon a time, we could say that that was an error. But to say that humans and dinosaurs live at the same time now is sheer insanity. It's a mental disorder, pure and simple. It's so ludicrous and so untenable that no one who has a clear mind or a sound mind could possibly suggest that humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time. The idea that the earth is no more than 10,000 years old, for example, when the Chalcolithic villages in Egypt are older than that, when we have settlements in North America which are older than 10,000 years. If you want to have a literalist understanding of the book of Genesis, you have severe problems because the flood of Noah would have taken place a few hundred years after the Great Pyramid was built in Egypt, and there was no interruption in the developments of Egyptian culture, society, and building. Adam would have died at the time when King Narmer of Egypt was uniting Upper and Lower Egypt and fighting the Libyans. And trade had been going on with Lebanon for cedar long before Adam would have died. So the ludicrousness and the corners into which people paint themselves, it's small wonder that a younger generation are opting for either atheism or Buddhism or something else. We cannot keep teaching patent falsehoods to a younger generation and expect them to buy into our falsehoods. But once they've caught on that we're going to lie about the age of the earth and about whether dinosaurs and humans lived at the same time, why should they believe anything else that we say? They have no reason and no basis upon which to take us seriously anymore. So I'd like to ask people to think a little bit about this, and sometimes to come out of your bitter rage and take time out for some kind of serious, prayerful contemplation and thought, and do a little bit of studying. Don't go seeking out some crackpots who substantiate your ideologies, but look at the broader spectrum of the developments in the sciences. And medical science in particular, which includes neurobiology, take it seriously. There are really solid, sound people who really love humanity developing in these sciences, and many people who are believers, who are cosmologists. So you can't just say that science is just a cabal of Jewish atheists who are trying to destroy Christianity. That doesn't make any sense. Your fear and your denunciation of science is based in the fact that you don't want to take time to learn, that you want to take refuge in a comfortable but completely untrue ideology or models of reality. And you're doing no service to anyone, you're not helping anyone to save their souls, you're not leading anyone to salvation. What you're doing is pushing more and more of the younger generation into atheism, and you're pushing them there with a stick and a whip. And I want to ask you to think seriously about it, and just as soon as your rage calms down because of what I said, stop, have a cup of fresh brewed coffee or a shot of brandy, and get a little bit peaceful, and think seriously about these things. And try to realize that the preaching of the gospel in the 21st century has no relation to the preaching of the gospel in the 19th century. That we have to reach out in a meaningful and knowledgeable way, taking advantage of the information that we have now at hand to try to lead people to our Lord God and Savior Jesus Christ, and to an understanding that the God who created the heavens and the earth didn't necessarily do it the way we want him to. He had his own recipe, he doesn't use ours. So this is really the message I rather hope to convey today. And I'm asking all of you to think seriously about it. I'd like to hear some discussion and input from you, but I don't want to hear any of these bitter, outraged ravings that I get so often. If you have a serious-minded question, and you want to seriously engage the issues and the questions, by all means, send me an email or send me on my inbox on YouTube. But if it's just rantings and ravings and howlings, don't bother, because I'll just tune them out. So thank you all for listening, and I do hope to hear from some of you who are actually serious-minded and who actually care about the younger generation and the way that the Orthodox Church can reach out to the world in our day. God bless you.